A black firefighter returns home, but one unlikely encounter at the airport changes everything. A black firefighter, exhausted from months battling wildfires out west, steps into the airport, ready to finally return home to his family. But just as he thinks the hardest part of his journey is over, everything changes. A security officer singles him out, questioning his credentials and forcing him to prove his identity right there, in front of a crowd. 7 minutes later, that same officer is being escorted out by his supervisor, fired on the spot. What unfolded next left bystanders stunned and sparked a ripple effect no one could have predicted. This is more than just a story about one man. It's a reflection of the quiet battles many fight every day. Stay with me. You won't want to miss this. Before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if this resonates with you, make sure to subscribe for more stories that matter. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons come from the moments we least expect. The airport terminal hummed with the restless energy of travelers moving in orchestrated chaos. Malcolm Davis stood at gate 37, his gaze drifting to the dark clouds pressing low against the Chicago skyline. He shifted the weight of his carry-on, feeling the familiar strain in his shoulders, a reminder of the hours spent at 35,000 feet, guiding passengers across oceans and time zones. Tonight, though, Malcolm was just another traveler. No uniform, no crisp captain's hat, just wore jeans and the navy sweater his daughter had given him last Christmas. It had been years since he sat on this side of the cabin door. And even longer since he found himself in first class without a cockpit checklist in hand. As he boarded, the flight attendant at the door barely glanced up from her polite script. "Welcome aboard, sir. 2A, on your right." Malcolm nodded, stepping inside. First class was half empty, the kind of quiet that money bought. He slid into the wide leather seat, stretched his legs, and felt the tension in his spine ease. A book creased and well-traveled settled into his lap. Across the aisle, a man in a sharp suit glanced up, did a double take, then returned to his newspaper with just a little too much focus. The small gesture wasn't new. Malcolm had lived long enough to recognize the look. Curiosity masked as coincidence. It was the woman in 2C who lingered longer, pearls resting against the soft collar of her blouse. She watched Malcolm with the delicate disapproval only a lifetime of polite society could cultivate. Her eyes darted between his worn paperback and the seat beneath him, as if the combination unraveled something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. Malcolm smiled to himself and opened his book. The quiet stretched until footsteps, soft but purposeful, broke it. "Excuse me, sir." Malcolm looked up, meeting the flight attendant's hesitant gaze. She was young, mid-30s perhaps, her professional mask betraying flickers of uncertainty. Her name tag read, "Julia. May I see your boarding pass?" His grip on the book loosened, but his eyes never left hers. A beat passed, heavy and deliberate. Then, wordlessly, Malcolm reached into his jacket pocket, unfolding the pass and offering it to her. Julia studied it, her lips pressing thin. "Ah, yes. 2A, just checking." She lingered a fraction too long, glancing once more at the seat, as if some unspoken algorithm failed to compute the man sitting before her. "Everything all right?" Malcolm asked, his voice even. "Oh, yes. Of course. Enjoy your flight." She tucked the pass back into his hand with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and hurried toward the galley. Malcolm watched her retreat, then turned to the window. The rain had started, tracing thin rivers down the glass. He thought about his father, then a man who never flew, never saw the country from above but understood the weight of being questioned. "It's not the fight that tires you," his father had said once. Hands stained with the day's work. That's the explanation. Malcolm closed the book in his lap, thumb holding his place. Tonight, he wasn't tired yet, but he knew that, sooner or later, the explanation would come. The plane hadn't left the ground, but the air felt heavy, like a storm waiting just beyond the runway lights. Malcolm could feel it in the shift of the cabin, the stolen glances, the silence stretching thin as the last passengers boarded. Julia passed through first class again, this time slower, her gaze lingering on Malcolm longer than it should have. Her steps faltered just slightly when she reached his row. And though she said nothing, Malcolm could see the questions gathering behind her eyes. She didn't ask them, not yet, but the hesitation spoke louder than words. Across the aisle, the man in the suit wasn't reading anymore. His eyes flicked between Malcolm and the flight attendant. His expression neutral but watchful. The woman in 2C adjusted her pearls with delicate precision, as if resetting them would restore a sense of order to the cabin. Malcolm tried to return to his book, but the words swam on the page. It wasn't the first time he'd felt like an intruder in spaces he had every right to occupy. Over the years, he had come to expect it. The moment when his presence demanded justification. Sometimes it was subtle, wrapped in pleasantries. Other times it was blunt, with no effort made to disguise the disbelief. Julia returned, this time with a drink for the woman in 2C. She handed it over with a bright smile, the ease of familiarity evident in her movements. But when her eyes flicked to Malcolm's seat, her smile thinned, as if something didn't sit quite right. Malcolm saw the thought take shape in her mind before she even opened her mouth. Mr. Davis, I just wanted to make sure. Julia's voice was light, practiced, but the way she leaned in, lowering her tone, betrayed the deeper current beneath her words. You're certain this is your seat? Malcolm set his book down, his thumb still holding his place. He met her gaze without blinking. I'm certain, he replied, his voice calm but firm. Julia hesitated, shifting slightly on her feet. The smile faltered, giving way to something more vulnerable, doubt. Maybe, or the uncomfortable awareness that she was standing too long at this moment. It's just that sometimes, with upgrades, there can be mix-ups, she added, though the words felt like an afterthought. Malcolm didn't answer right away. He let the silence settle between them, heavy and unyielding. Is there a problem with my boarding pass? He asked finally. Julia's eyes flicked to the folded paper resting on the armrest. She had seen it, checked it, but still, her hand hovered for just a second too long. No, sir, no problem, she replied quickly, stepping back. Enjoy your flight. But Malcolm wasn't sure she believed her own words. He could feel the shift in the cabin as she walked away. The man across the aisle shifted in his seat, clearing his throat softly. The woman in 2C avoided eye contact altogether, her attention fixed on the window as if the conversation had never happened. Malcolm exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the edges of his book. It wasn't anger that stirred beneath his ribs. It was something quieter, more familiar. The weight of expectation. The constant awareness that no matter how far he had come, there would always be someone who needed proof he belonged. The plane taxied toward the runway, and Malcolm settled deeper into his seat, staring out at the tarmac lights flickering in the rain. The flight hadn't even begun, but the turbulence had already arrived. The plane had barely reached cruising altitude when Julia appeared again, this time with less hesitation but more certainty in her step. She wasn't alone. Another flight attendant, older, with the composed air of authority, trailed just behind her. Malcolm felt their approach before he saw them. The way quiet rippled down the aisle as first-class passengers pretended not to notice. The man across the aisle didn't even bother with the pretense. His eyes tracked their every movement, his pen tapping idly against the cover of his report. Mr. Davis, Julia began, her voice quieter now, meant only for him. I apologize for disturbing you again. But, her words hung in the air, unfinished. The other attendant, whose name tag read, M. Howard, stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral. We just need to verify your seat assignment one more time, Howard said, her tone polite but firm. The kind of voice that expected cooperation without question. Malcolm didn't move at first. He let their request sit there between them, heavy and unmoving. His boarding pass lay on the armrest, precisely where Julia had returned it. The same seat number, the same confirmation that hadn't changed since the first time they asked. Malcolm picked it up slowly, holding it out between two fingers like an offering. Neither of the women took it right away. Julia glanced at Howard, waiting for her cue, and Howard, after a brief hesitation, accepted the slip of paper and examined it. The silence around them stretched thin, held together by the collective breath of the cabin. Malcolm watched Howard's eyes scan the boarding pass. A flicker of something. Surprise. Perhaps crossed her face before she carefully masked it. Everything appears to be in order, she said, returning the pass with a nod. But she lingered, her gaze narrowing slightly as if searching for something invisible. May I ask, Malcolm said, his voice measured, how many times you verify the seats of other passengers? Julia shifted, looking uncomfortable, but Howard met his gaze head on. Of course, she replied, as though the question didn't graze her. We occasionally double-check seat assignments when things seem irregular. There it was. The word hung in the air, and Malcolm let it settle into the space between them. Irregular, he repeated, turning the word over carefully. His tone was soft, but there was an edge beneath it. I suppose I should be grateful I'm keeping things interesting. Howard's lips pressed into a tight line. But she said nothing. Julia glanced down, studying the carpet as if it held answers. Malcolm could feel the eyes on him. The man across the aisle. The woman with the pearls. The businessman at the far end of the cabin who had been pretending to sleep. None of them had missed a beat. Howard nodded stiffly, stepping back. Let us know if you need anything. Mr. Davis. I'll do that, Malcolm replied, folding his boarding pass neatly and slipping it back into his pocket. They walked away without another word. But Malcolm noticed the slight stiffness in Julia's stride as she disappeared toward the galley. The man across the aisle leaned slightly toward Malcolm, his voice low enough that only they could hear. Don't take it personally, he murmured, they're just doing their job. Malcolm smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. Oh, I know, he said quietly. The question is, do they? The man looked away, returning to his papers with sudden interest. And Malcolm reopened his book. But the words were harder to focus on now, blurring at the edges. The cabin had settled back into its usual hum. But Malcolm felt a shift in the air. The way suspicion lingered long after the questions stopped. It was the kind of turbulence that never quite showed up on radar. The plane cruised steady above the clouds. But inside the cabin, tension hung like the static before a storm. Malcolm could feel it. Not in the air itself, but in the way people moved around him. Careful and calculated, like dancers afraid of stepping too close. Julia hadn't returned to his row since the last exchange. When she passed through the cabin, her gaze skirted over him, landing on everything except the man in 2A. He'd seen that before. The shift from polite doubt to quiet avoidance. The problem, once confronted, became invisible, but the weight of it remained. Malcolm had turned back to his book, though the words unraveled in his hands. Across the aisle, the man in the suit, let's call him Mr. Walker, because that was the kind of name men like him often carried. Was still watching. Not openly, no. Walker had mastered the art of peripheral attention. The way some people watch a street performer but pretend they're just passing by. Malcolm let him look. It wasn't long before it happened again. Julia returned, her face tight, this time holding a tablet in her hand. She approached cautiously, like someone approaching a door they weren't sure they wanted to open. Mr. Davis, she began, her voice light but stretched thin at the edges. I'm sorry to bother you again. There seems to be some confusion. Malcolm set his book aside and raised an eyebrow. Another mix-up? Julia hesitated, glancing toward the galley as if searching for backup. Howard wasn't far, lingering just out of sight, pretending to inspect the beverage cart. There was a last-minute seat reassignment that may not have been updated properly. Julia continued, tapping at the screen in front of her. Though Malcolm doubted she saw much of anything. I just need to confirm your reservation. Malcolm's grip on the armrest tightened. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough that he felt it. He spoke carefully, the way a man speaks when he knows each word carries weight. You've seen my boarding pass. Twice, if I'm not mistaken. Julia's eyes flicked to the passengers nearby. The unspoken plea for this to remain quiet. It's just protocol, she replied, though the words rang hollow. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. No, the protocol was the first time. Maybe even the second. This? He gestured around the cabin, where passengers were pretending not to listen. This is something else. Julia swallowed hard, and for a moment, Malcolm saw something flash behind her eyes, uncertainty. Yes. But maybe shame too. But shame, he knew, was never the final word in these moments. It was then that the intercom crackled, breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. "Attention, crew. We need immediate assistance in the cockpit." The words sliced through the cabin, and Malcolm watched as Julia's entire demeanor shifted. Her eyes widened, and she stepped back, tablet forgotten by her side. Howard appeared almost instantly, but not for Malcolm. She hurried toward the front, disappearing behind the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. Malcolm didn't move, but he felt the eyes, Walker's. The woman in 2C. The elderly couple in 3A and 3B. The eyes that asked silent questions. It wasn't long before Howard returned, this time walking directly toward him. "Mr. Davis," she said quietly, leaning in close enough that only he could hear. "Captain Stevens requests your presence in the cockpit." Immediately, the words fell like a stone into deep water. Malcolm let them sink in for just a moment before he rose, smoothing his sweater as he stood. Julia stepped aside quickly, and Walker, still holding that pen, watched him with new eyes. Malcolm met his gaze briefly, then started toward the front of the cabin. The aisle felt longer than usual, each step carrying the weight of unspoken judgments. Passengers followed him with their eyes, curiosity flickering beneath the surface of their polite expressions. Malcolm said nothing. He didn't need to. By the time he stepped through the cockpit door, the tension in the cabin had shifted. He could feel it settle behind him like a shadow, a silent reminder that sometimes, the hardest thing to do was simply to exist in the space you had earned. The cockpit was colder than the cabin, humming with the quiet urgency of machines that never slept. Captain Stevens sat rigid in his seat, one hand gripping the edge of the throttle while the other rested too lightly against his temple. His skin was pale beneath the glow of the instrument panel. Malcolm stepped inside, and in that instant, there was no hesitation. No questioning of his right to be there. The door shut behind him with a soft click, sealing him into the space where his authority was unquestioned. Stevens managed a weak smile, though it barely touched his eyes. "Davis, good timing. Is he stable?" Malcolm asked, nodding toward the empty co-pilot's seat. Stevens exhaled through his nose. "He's with the medical team in the crew quarters. Blood pressure dropped hard about 20 minutes after takeoff." He gestured at the array of controls and blinking lights. "We're steady for now, but I wasn't about to make it to JFK alone." Malcolm slid into the co-pilot's chair, his hands moving over the familiar instruments with the ease of someone who had long since stopped thinking about the mechanics of the job. A soft tension, not quite fear, still lingered in the air. It wasn't just the cockpit that felt it. Through the thin barrier of the door, Malcolm could sense the quiet hum of the cabin behind them, passengers wondering, speculating, piecing together fragments of what they had seen and what they thought they understood. "Let's get her home," Malcolm said simply, flipping a switch overhead. Stevens smiled, this time with something closer to relief. By the time they leveled at cruising altitude, the cabin had begun to relax again. Drinks were poured, and soft murmurs rippled down the aisles like water finding its course. Malcolm's voice came over the intercom, warm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Davis speaking. We've experienced a minor crew adjustment, but everything is under control. We'll be arriving in New York on schedule. Sit back and enjoy the remainder of your flight." There was no mistaking the shift that followed. The words weren't anything extraordinary, not on paper, but hearing Malcolm's voice, hearing the authority, the confidence, forced a quiet recalibration in the minds of those who had questioned him before. Julia, standing at the front of the cabin, felt the weight of it most. She had spent the last half-hour avoiding the gaze of passengers, slipping in and out of the galley as if moving fast enough could erase the earlier confrontation. But as Malcolm's voice faded into the hum of the engines, she knew avoidance had reached its limit. Walker, across the aisle, set down his glass and folded his hands neatly in his lap. His gaze lingered on the curtain separating first class from the cockpit, his expression unreadable. The woman in 2C shifted uncomfortably, her pearls clicking softly with the movement. It was a sound Malcolm had learned to recognize, a kind of silent reckoning. The slow, uneasy acknowledgement of something people wished they hadn't overlooked. But acknowledgement was never quite the same as apology. An hour later, Julia found herself standing at the edge of Malcolm's empty seat in 2A. His book, creased, dog-eared, still lay open on the armrest. The words tracing stories she would never know. She hovered there for a long moment before reaching out, carefully folding the cover closed and setting the book gently beside his glass of water. It was such a small thing, so small it felt absurd. But it was all she could think to do. Howard appeared at her side, glancing down at the book. He's flown for nearly 20 years. Howard said quietly, as if sensing Julia's thoughts. International routes mostly. I flew with him once. Back when I was new. The crew respected him. The passengers didn't always. Julia swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on the book. I thought I was past this. She admitted softly. I thought I'd learned better than to assume. Howard's lips pressed into a thin line, though there was no accusation in her eyes. We all think that, she replied, until the moment comes, and we realize we haven't. Julia nodded, but the knot in her stomach tightened, refusing to let her off so easily. Through the cockpit door, Malcolm's voice drifted softly, this time in quiet conversation with Stevens. The casual back and forth of two men who had long since mastered the art of navigating both machines and people. Julia lingered by the seat for another moment before finally stepping away. The echo of her misstep trailing behind her like footprints in the snow. The cabin lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the faces of passengers who had begun to drift into the half-sleep that long flights encouraged. Malcolm could feel the stillness behind him even through the closed cockpit door. An absence of sound that spoke louder than words ever could. Stevens glanced over at him, the quiet hum of the instruments filling the space between them. Are you all right handling things up here for a bit? Stevens asked, though Malcolm could tell the question was more courtesy than concern. Yeah, Malcolm replied, his hands resting lightly on the controls. Go stretch your legs. Stevens unbuckled, rising with a groan that betrayed his years. Getting old, he muttered with a grin, stepping into the cabin and letting the door click shut behind him. Malcolm was alone now. Alone, but not isolated. He could still feel them, their eyes, their questions. He knew that when Stevens walked out there, heads would turn, curious glances would follow him down the aisle, wondering if he had left the cockpit truly unattended. And yet, no one would ask. Not out loud. Malcolm adjusted the heading slightly, his fingers moving with instinct more than thought. The familiarity of the controls was a comfort. But tonight even that comfort felt thin. The intercom crackled softly, and Malcolm's hand hovered over the switch. He considered speaking. Some brief announcement to remind them he was still here. That everything was as it should be. But he knew what would happen if he did. There would be a pause. A subtle shift in the atmosphere. Not panic. No. Nothing so obvious. Just a doubt. That quiet, creeping doubt that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Lingering behind him like a shadow that stretched just far enough to touch the people around him. It was always there. On planes. In airports. In hotel lobbies. Even in the homes of men and women who invited him in. Smiling and polite, but always keeping just enough distance to remind him that he was welcome, but not entirely. Malcolm let his hand fall away from the intercom. Outside the cockpit, Stevens made his way down the aisle, nodding occasionally at passengers who sat up straighter as he passed. Julia watched him from the galley, the knot in her stomach twisting tighter. She had wanted to apologize earlier, had rehearsed it in her head at least a dozen times. But when Malcolm emerged briefly during their layover in Denver, when he walked through the terminal with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove, the words had stuck in her throat. Now, with the plane suspended in the sky, that silence felt heavier. The elderly woman in 2C shifted beneath her blanket, the soft rustle of fabric breaking the quiet. When Julia passed by, the woman glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly. Can I ask you something? The woman whispered, gesturing toward the cockpit. Julia braced herself. She already knew the question. That pilot, the woman began, her voice low enough that it didn't carry beyond her seat. He's trained for this, isn't he? Julia's mouth felt dry. He's one of our senior pilots. She answered carefully. He's been with the airline for almost 20 years. The woman's eyes flicked toward the cockpit, as if the explanation needed to be seen to be believed. I'm sure he's very capable, the woman replied, though the reassurance sounded like it was meant more for herself than for Julia. Julia smiled politely and excused herself. In the galley, Howard was preparing coffee. She didn't look up when Julia approached. You'd think after 20 years in that seat, he wouldn't have to prove himself every damn time, Howard said softly, stirring sugar into her cup. Julia leaned against the counter, staring at the curtain separating the galley from the cabin. It's not fair, Julia murmured. Howard glanced over, raising an eyebrow. Fair? She echoed with a faint laugh. Fair's got nothing to do with it. Julia sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. It's not fair, Howard continued, her voice quieter now. It's about expectation. People see what they expect to see. And when they don't, well, she let the thought trail off. Julia nodded but said nothing. She thought back to the first moment she saw Malcolm board the plane. How she had scanned the passengers, making quick judgments without even realizing it. She hadn't expected him. And somehow, that single fact had unraveled everything that followed. Howard handed Julia a cup of coffee and patted her arm lightly. Next time, Howard said, just let him sit in his seat. Julia stared into the dark surface of the coffee. She wondered if it could really be that simple. The plane drifted forward through the night sky, quiet but constant, as if drawn by something older than the engines that carried it. Below, the lights of small towns flickered faintly, scattered across the dark like distant stars. Malcolm sat in the cockpit, his gaze steady on the horizon. But his thoughts had begun to drift, backward, not forward. It was strange how time bent in places like this. Up here, miles above the ground, the past felt closer, like it could slip through the thin skin of memory and sit beside him in the empty co-pilot's chair. And sometimes, it did. Malcolm remembered the first time he set foot in a cockpit as a young man. Full of quiet excitement but carrying something heavier in his chest, something no one had named but that he could feel just the same. Back then, he hadn't been entirely sure whether he belonged. But he had shown up anyway. Showing up had become a habit. Even now, after all these years, he was still showing up. But tonight, he wondered why the weight hadn't lifted. Captain Stevens reappeared at the cockpit door, sliding into his seat with a soft sigh. All clear back there, Stevens said, strapping himself in and adjusting the throttle. His voice was light, but Malcolm caught the subtle way his eyes flicked to the control panel, as if double-checking to make sure nothing had gone unnoticed. Malcolm let it slide. Good, he replied. Stevens glanced sideways, his hands resting loosely on his lap. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the steady hum of the engines filling the space between them. You know, Stevens began, his tone shifting to something softer. I heard about what happened with Julia. Malcolm didn't respond right away. He kept his gaze forward, the glow of the instruments reflecting faintly in his eyes. Things like that, Malcolm said finally, his voice even. They happen quietly. Most people don't notice. But some of us. He tapped the throttle lightly with his fingertips. Some of us notice every time. Stevens exhaled through his nose, rubbing the bridge of it like he was working out the right thing to say. She's young, Stevens offered after a pause. Malcolm gave him a small, tight smile. Aren't they always? Neither of them laughed. Because the truth was, it wasn't about Julia. Not really. Julia was just a piece of something larger, something stitched into the seams of places like this, where the sky stretched wide but the space for certain men felt smaller than it should. You get tired of it? Stevens asked quietly. Malcolm didn't answer right away. Instead, he thought about his father, who had been tired long before Malcolm was old enough to understand why. He thought about the men who had come before him, the ones who had built the road he was walking now, even though they knew they wouldn't reach the end of it themselves. Tired wasn't the right word. You don't get tired, Malcolm replied at last, his voice low but steady. You get used to it. Stevens nodded slowly, as if he understood, but Malcolm wondered if he truly did. The plane banked slightly, drifting gently to the right. and Malcolm adjusted the heading without thinking, his hands moving in rhythm with the machine. After a while, Stevens leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "You know," he said, his eyes half closed, "when I was a kid, I wanted to be a pilot because it felt like freedom. Thought flying meant leaving everything behind, being above it all." Malcolm glanced at him, but Stevens kept his gaze fixed on the windshield, watching the sky stretch endlessly ahead of them. "Turns out," Malcolm said softly, "you can take the sky, but the ground follows you." Stevens nodded, and this time Malcolm believed he understood. Behind them, the cabin was dark, the passengers lulled into uneasy sleep by the steady vibration of the engines. Julia moved quietly between the aisles, her footsteps soft against the carpet. She carried a tray of water, but her thoughts were elsewhere, caught between the weight of what had happened and the question of how to carry it forward. When she reached seat 2A, she paused. Malcolm's book still lay on the armrest, untouched since he left for the cockpit. Julia stared at it for a long moment. And then, without quite knowing why, she opened the cover and carefully placed his boarding pass between the pages, marking the spot where he had stopped reading. The shadows in the cabin shifted slightly, but they did not disappear. They never did. The plane began its slow, deliberate descent into New York, the city's lights flickering in the distance like embers beneath a heavy sky. The hum of the engines softened, and with it, the cabin stirred passengers waking from restless sleep, gathering their belongings, smoothing the creases in their clothes as if to prepare themselves for whatever awaited them on the ground. Malcolm watched the horizon tilt slightly as he guided the plane lower, hands steady on the controls. Beside him, Stevens adjusted the radio, confirming their approach with air traffic control. For a brief moment, it felt peaceful, but peace, Malcolm knew, was always temporary. A voice broke through the intercom, Julia's voice, announcing final descent. It was steady, professional, but Malcolm caught the slight tremble beneath the surface. He had heard that tone before, many times, from people who had come face to face with the part of themselves they did not want to see, the part they could no longer deny. Stevens glanced sideways. "You want to take this all the way in?" Malcolm nodded. "All right," Stevens said, leaning back. His voice carried no doubt, no second guessing. The plane sank lower, clouds brushing past the windshield like smoke. Malcolm's grip on the yoke was firm but relaxed, the kind of grip that came only from experience. Not just with flying, but with everything else. The runway lights stretched out ahead, guiding them toward the ground. Behind the cockpit door, the weight of the cabin lingered. Malcolm couldn't see them, but he could feel them. Julia, Walker, the woman in 2C. All of them wrapped in the same quiet tension that had hovered over this flight since the beginning. Even now, as the landing gear lowered with a soft thud beneath their feet, the doubt still lingered in the air. Because landing wasn't just about touching down. It was about whether people trusted you to do it. When the plane finally came to a stop at the gate, the cabin erupted into the usual chorus of rustling coats, clinking seat belts, and quiet conversations about the weather. The moment had passed. For most of them, it was over, but not for Malcolm. As he opened the cockpit door and stepped into the cabin, the hum of conversation dipped. Just briefly, just enough for him to notice. Walker glanced up from his seat, his eyes meeting Malcolm's. There was no hostility there, just quiet observation. A man taking note of something he wasn't sure how to process. The woman in 2C shifted uncomfortably, offering Malcolm a polite but uncertain smile. Julia stood near the galley, stiff but composed. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. Malcolm moved down the aisle slowly, his bag slung over one shoulder. No one said a word, but the silence itself spoke volumes. As he reached the exit, Julia stepped forward. Her voice was soft, barely louder than the hum of the engines. "Captain Davis," she began, then hesitated, as if the words she needed weren't quite ready to meet the air. Malcolm paused, waiting. She stopped again, exhaling sharply. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." The words hung there, fragile and uncertain. Malcolm studied her face, searching for something deeper than the apology itself. And in the quiet behind her eyes, He found it. The weight of recognition. It wasn't much. But it was a beginning. Thank you, Malcolm said simply, nodding as he stepped past her and out into the terminal. Later that night, as Malcolm stood in the taxi line outside JFK, the cold air biting at his face, he thought of his father again. He thought about the long road that had brought him here. The one paved by men and women who had carried far heavier burdens than he ever would. And he wondered how many more flights it would take before that road began to feel lighter. A cab pulled up, and Malcolm slid into the back seat, dropping his bag beside him. Where to? The driver asked. Malcolm leaned back, his eyes drifting toward the city stretched out ahead. Home, he said softly, and as the cab pulled away from the curb, Malcolm let the quiet settle over him, knowing that even the longest shadows eventually had to rest.